Well, I always love speaking to young people. So hello, everybody. And we're all undergrads here, is that right? Amazing, amazing. Look, I think it's really important when people have conversations about different parts of the world to understand how we're not just talking about those parts of the world, but how we're talking about challenges we all face everywhere. And somebody who was a very beautiful man who spent many years in Oxford, also many years in Cambridge, the philosopher Bernard Williams, always liked to say that one thing we get out of looking at cultural circumstances that are very different to our own is that in them we can find intensified versions of things, intensified versions of challenges that we in a more modest form find here at home, wherever home is for us. So when we're talking about Ukraine, or when we're talking about Russia, when we're talking about Belarus, we're not just talking about these countries, we're talking about some of the global challenges that are confronting us wherever we are, and however mobile our camera happens to be as one speaks. Now, I think, look, the argument can be made that the two biggest challenges that we face in the 21st century are the climate crisis and democratic decline, democratic degeneration, democratic backsliding. Different people call it different things. And this issue about democracy is connected with every other issue we face. We can't address the climate crisis unless we address issues of democratic sustenance. We can't address any other issue, in fact, unless we address issues of democratic sustenance. So when we are talking about how Ukraine is forming a very fresh kind of civic nationalism, or when Russia's civic order is disintegrating into unbelievable toxicity, we're partly reflecting on what's going on in these places, but we're also partly reflecting on global challenges, because many of the mechanics that are causing fragility in our democracies are not national, but they're actually going on everywhere. And then I want to put on the table a couple of other things that I think is really important when we're talking with folks of the younger generation. I was last a student about 10, 15 years ago when I was doing my doctorate. And in a certain way, things I feel were easier for me than they are for you guys. Because I think particularly in elite academic institutions, there are certain factors that make it harder and not easier for students now to think for themselves. There's quite a bit of a press coming onto you to incorporate into you bits of, bits of thinking, bits of articulation that are pre-prepared for you and left on a shelf, and you're expected to put that stuff inside you and spit it back out. And so when we're talking with young people, it's so important to emphasize the idea of thinking for yourself, which doesn't mean thinking originally, it doesn't mean thinking well, but the importance of thinking for yourself is absolutely extraordinary. And I actually think you guys are under certain kinds of pressures that make that harder for you than that was for previous generations. And let me throw just one last thing that's so unbelievably obvious, but I think it's still important on the table. And that's that, of course, you're at Oxford University, and it's a very magical place. And it's a very magical place because it's a place where knowledge is generated, where expertise is generated. And you might say, well, who is this guy? And he's going to tell us that water is wet next. Look, but there's something very special there, because democracies only endure if they are tethered to the practiced virtue of truthfulness, which is a kind of resonance of Bernard Williams as well, who I mentioned earlier. And that means that the expertise that people at your institution have, and the expertise that your institution cherishes and generates, is of extraordinary importance, not just as an end in itself, but as a way of us sustaining the kind of cultural and political life that we want to enjoy.